100 years ago, the sound of 1650 bullets tore through the city of Amritsar. In its wake, it left behind the screams of the innocent victims of an empire. It has been a long time since, but these screams, these sounds, they refuse to die. Hello friends, and welcome to History Through Stories. Today we are looking at the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Well, as an example of colonial repression, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre stands in singular isolation. This is a story of more than 1,000 civilians killed in cold blood, all in the name of security and order. But we all know this story because as a nation it is part of our DNA. As a nation it is the story of who we are. So ours is not going to be a simple retelling of this story. Well, instead, our effort here will be to pry out distinct elements from within the story. What we will try to do is to investigate upon the motivations of the British administration behind such acts. We will also try to see what these kind of actions meant for the native population of India. But most importantly, we will try to understand why the Jallianwala Bagh incident is a seminal event in the emergence of India as a nation. Before we proceed with our story, let us first take a look at the principal characters involved. And in this list, the first name that pops up is that of Michael O'Dwyer. Now, Mr. Michael O'Dwyer was born to a family of humble landowners in Ireland, but by dint of sheer hard work and merit, he had entered the Indian civil services. As a civil servant, he had distinguished himself as a revenue administrator under the administration of Lord Curzon. But his big break came during the administration of Lord Hardinge, when he was made the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, a position that he held from 1912 up until the events of 1919. Our second and perhaps more recognizable character in this story is that of Brigadier General Reginald Dyer. Now, General Dyer was born in India. He was born in the Punjab province and he received his early education at Punjab and Shimla. However, for his higher studies, he had gone to Ireland and then again in England. From the Sandhurst Military College, he received his education in the military, and from there he graduated as a military officer. He was posted as a lieutenant in the British Indian Army. As a member of the British Indian Army, he had served in the Third Anglo-Burmese War and he also served in the First World War. So by the time he was posted as in charge of martial law in Amritsar, he was already a highly decorated war veteran. So this is the personality which later on will go on to carry out a massacre in India. The third character in our story is not a person at all. It is a piece of legislation, the Revolutionary and Anarchical Crimes Act. Today it is known as the Rowlatt Act, named after Justice Rowlatt, the person who was in charge of drafting committee who drafted this act. Now, this act was an extension of the Defence of India Act, which was a wartime measure which was aimed at curbing revolutionary activities during the First World War. Now, the British administration wanted to institutionalize the provisions of the Defence of India Act into a formal law and perhaps to hold India in a constant state of war. Now, this new act, which came into effect on the 10th of March 1919, provided the executive with extensive powers in their fight against the menace of revolutionary activities in India. As such, it provided the executive with powers over the press. It also provided for arrest without warrants and, most importantly, detention without trial. Now, naturally, such limitations over civil liberties of individuals came under extensive criticisms from across the political spectrum, and not least from the Indian National Congress and Mahatma Gandhi himself. Well, let us take a second look at our principal characters. What do we see? We see that they encapsulate the ideology behind the British Empire, an ideology which was based upon the idea that Indians are essentially incapable of ruling themselves. It was also based upon the idea that order must be maintained within the empire at all costs, even if it means cost to human lives. Moreover, for men like O'Dwyer and Dyer, the war has not ended. The First World War, of course, had ended for everybody else, but for them, it had just begun because they were afraid. They were afraid and constantly under threat of an uprising from within India in the style of 1857. And therefore, when the first justification arrived for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, it was based upon a rumor. And the rumor was that India was to be invaded from Afghanistan. So they said that they carried out their actions in accordance to the intelligence that they had. Well, Punjab on the eve of the Rowlatt Satyagraha was a relatively peaceful province. The last major uprising in Punjab was that of the Ghadar uprising of 1915, which was efficiently put down by the British administration. But underneath, the tensions were flaring up. The administration of Michael O'Dwyer as Lieutenant Governor in Punjab had been heavy-handed, and he was also not known as a man of sympathies for responsible self-government. He was also very critical of the Indian intelligentsia, which was at the forefront of the movement for responsible self-government in Punjab. Moreover, during the First World War, the British administration of Punjab had launched a recruitment drive into the army. And although the drive was very successful, there were allegations of gross misconduct during this drive, and some also alleged forceful recruitment into the army. Therefore, it is not a far-fetched idea to say that Punjab and the population of Punjab was already on edge. Well, it was under such conditions that on the 6th of April 1919, Gandhiji gave out a call for a general strike all across India in protest for the implementation of the Rowlatt Act. And Gandhiji at this point of time was relatively new to the political arena of India, and he was still experimenting with Satyagraha as a means of protest against the British Empire. What we see is that the Indian masses were still not ready to receive the gospel of non-violence, and therefore, even though the Hartal was a success, we see that in the ensuing days there were instances of violence all across India, especially in the province of Punjab, which we will be talking about. Violence erupted on the 10th of April 1919 when protesting Indians staged a demonstration in front of the bungalow of the District Commissioner of Amritsar. Now, these Indians were protesting against the arrest of Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, who were prominent nationalist leaders. Now, these leaders had been arrested earlier and they were hidden away in a secret location. However, in return, they were fired at by a contingent of military personnel, which resulted in the loss of life of several Indians. Remember, this is not the Salt Satyagraha. So, non-violence as a means of protest against the British administration is not yet the established norm. The people therefore reacted with violence, and in the ensuing violent activities, a lot of European establishments such as banks and offices were destroyed. People engaged in activities of arson and violence, and in the ensuing violence against Europeans, 3 lives were claimed. But the breaking point was reached on the 11th of April 1919, where a missionary by the name of Marcella Serwood was waylaid, and she was violently attacked by a mob. She managed to escape the mob, but it gave the British administration a very perfect pretext to launch martial law within the city of Amritsar. Civil liberties were suspended and a curfew was put in place. Any and all assembly of people was deemed illegal, and Brigadier General Dyer, who was stationed at Jalandhar, returned to Amritsar to enforce martial law. And now we come to the fateful day, a day of unprecedented depredations from the colonial government, a day when every Indian faced the real possibility of complete and total dehumanization. On the 13th of April 1919, administrators in the city of Amritsar were making rounds announcing the passing of martial law. These announcements were made in Hindi, English, Urdu and Punjabi. However, it has been alleged that the administrators did not take much attention into making the people know of the restrictions in place. Whatever be the case, it was also the day of Baisakhi, the Sikh New Year and the Spring Harvest Festival. Thousands of pilgrims had gathered into the city of Amritsar to offer prayers at the holy shrine of Harmandir Sahib, or the Golden Temple as it is known today. By mid-morning, the CID had found out that there was going to be a general assembly at Jallianwala Bagh. General Dyer was duly informed, and now the onus fell upon him to deal with the situation as he saw fit. Jallianwala Bagh is a walled enclosure of roughly 7 acres in area. There are 5 narrow entrances to the garden, most of which remain locked, and there is also a central well which used to serve as a water source for the vicinity. Now it was within this garden that General Dyer poured in with 90 of his men, 50 of whom were armed with the 303 bolt-action rifles, and together they carried ammunitions of up to 1650 rounds of bullets. When General Dyer arrived, he confronted a disparate group of people composed of Sikhs, Hindus and Muslims. But most importantly, there were even women and children in this group, and it was into this group that General Dyer ordered his men to fire. Men, women and children were all systematically mowed down by the volley of gunfire, which was guided towards the thickest part of the group. People started fleeing, they started climbing over each other. Some people even jumped into the well for shelter. You see, the situation was really desperate. Now, General Dyer was a man at war, and for him, these pilgrims who had assembled in this garden was the enemy, an enemy which needed to be ruthlessly and very efficiently destroyed. The end result was over 1,000 dead and 1,500 injured. The collective humanity of our nation lay dead on the ground at Amritsar. Well, initially, the extent of the massacre was downplayed. The official estimates that were provided was about 379 in casualties. The pretext that was given by both the Lieutenant Governor and General Dyer was that the assembly was part of a larger conspiracy to overthrow the British government. But soon, this pretext it fell apart because the severity of the scale of the massacre became apparent. The massacre came under widespread denouncement from all across India, and even British officials were appalled and shocked by the event. One of the first persons to denounce the act was the Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu. He asserted that the actions of the O'Dwyer administration of Punjab had been a grave error in judgment. Referring to the event in the British Parliament, he asked the fatal question, is the Raj going to hold on to the empire through terror, or is it going to hold on to the empire through the goodwill of the people? Winston Churchill went a step further to assert that the actions of General Dyer was tantamount to murder or at least manslaughter. However, the most eloquent expression of protest comes in the form of Rabindranath Tagore's renunciation of the knighthood. For him, perpetrators of such dastardly acts were not fit to award anybody with recognitions. Following the incidents, a commission of inquiry was instituted headed by Lord Hunter. Now, this commission was to inquire into the Punjab disturbances of 1919. Now, when General Dyer was questioned by this commission, we find out that he was a man who was remorseless for his actions. For him, he was just doing his duty as the situation prescribed. Now, this commission's inquiry gives us a rare insight into the psyche of a man who was fiercely devoted to the idea of the empire. For him, keeping the law and order situation was of paramount importance, even if it means killing people. He even asserted that he wanted to terrorize the people of Punjab into obedience and not win their goodwill. Now, a famous narrative about the Jallianwala Bagh incident is how General Dyer was questioned if he would have moved the armoured cars along with him into the Bagh, even though it meant that there would have been higher number of casualties, and he asserted in the affirmative. What it reveals to us is the psychology behind the officers of this empire and what kind of loyalty and devotion to the idea of the empire the officers carried. And perhaps this is one of the reasons behind the brutality of the British Empire in India and behind the brutality of the acts of the British Empire in India during the Indian freedom struggle movement. Now, what is the legacy of the Jallianwala Bagh incident? Well, for different people it meant different things. For Lieutenant Governor Michael O'Dwyer, it meant the end of his term as the Governor of Punjab. He earned disrepute and he earned discredit from all across the British establishment. For General Dyer, it meant the earning of a nickname, the Butcher of Amritsar. However, it is interesting to note that he also earned the nickname, the Saviour of India, and Rudyard Kipling was very vocal in his praise of the actions of General Dyer. The Morning Post, which was an influential newspaper based in England, even organized a fundraising campaign for General Dyer, which was able to raise tens of thousands of pounds for General Dyer and his actions. However, it is also very interesting to note that the victims of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre were only awarded 500 rupees each. Now, the cost of a life in the empire is 500 rupees. That's something we must remember. However, for us as a nation, the Jallianwala Bagh incident carries a far greater significance. As a post-colonial society, we have to keep reminding ourselves that colonialism was not merely a political or an economic structure, but it was indeed an ideology. An ideology which was based upon the idea that the East was inherently inferior than the West. And therefore, in order to alleviate the inferiority of the East, there must be some kind of intervention from the West. This came for us in the form of the British government of India. But instances such as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre dispels this particular myth about the British Empire. that the British Empire was an altruistic empire working for the betterment of Indians as a society, as a civilization, that it was a benevolent empire which was here to restore peace and order. Now the Jallianwala Bagh massacre led even those staunchest loyalists of the empire to turn their backs against it. The case in point here is Gandhi. But then of course you might ask us the question, what is its relevance for us now? Well, the answer is simple. As a society and as a nation, we must say no to colonialism and imperialism in all its forms. And above all, we must have the courage to protest against all forms of violence in the name of security and order. With that, I take your leave for today and thank you for watching History Through Stories, where we recount stories of the past in order to learn of our present better. Thank you for watching History Through Stories. If you liked our video, please subscribe to our channel and share it with your friends and family.